was 15 when it happened. It was a Friday night in late September, just starting to get cold where I lived. My parents went out to dinner with some family friends, and they said they would not be home until late. I had the house to myself. I invited over my neighbor and best friend Chris. He was the same age as me and lived across the street. We usually hung out in my basement and played games or watched movies, but that night we got bored. At some point, he brought up playing hide and seek. It sounded dumb at first, but we had done it before with a group, and it had been fun. The house was small, but it had a lot of places to hide, especially in the dark. We turned off most of the lights to make it scarier. The only light on was in the kitchen. The rules were simple. No going outside, no going into the attic or the crawl space. Basement, bedrooms, closets, and under furniture were all fair game. Chris wanted to hide first, so I covered my eyes in the living room and counted to 50. I could hear him running at first, and then silence. I finished counting and announced that I was coming. I started in the kitchen since it was right there, but there was nowhere good to hide. I checked behind the basement door, then down the hall. I looked in the bathroom. Empty. I opened the closet near the front door. Nothing. I went upstairs. The floor creaked under me, and every little sound made me tense. I checked my parents' bedroom first, looking under the bed and behind the dresser. Nobody. I went down the hall into my room. It was messy, but not enough for Chris to hide well. I still checked the closet and under the desk. Nothing. That left the guest room at the end of the hall. The door was cracked open. I pushed it slowly, expecting him to jump out and scare me, but the room was dark and quiet. I stepped inside and scanned around. I bent down to look under the bed. Nothing. I opened the closet door. Empty. At that point, I thought maybe he was in the basement, so I went back downstairs. I checked behind the laundry machines and in the storage space under the stairs. I was about to give up when I finally found him curled up behind some boxes. He laughed and asked how long it had taken me. I told him way too long. Then we switched. He counted and I hid. I went upstairs and slid under the guest bed, pulling the bed skirt down to cover me. My heart raced while I lay there in the dark. I heard him come upstairs a few minutes later, his footsteps slow and heavy on the floor. He opened the bathroom door first, then he stepped into my parents' room. After a while, the footsteps came down the hall toward where I was. I could hear him breathing as he walked into the guest room. He stopped near the bed. I held my breath. His shoes shuffled against the carpet. Then silence, a long silence. I thought he had figured it out and was about to yank up the bed skirt, but instead, he walked out. I lay there a few more minutes, waiting to hear him call that I had won, but the house stayed too quiet. Finally, I crawled out. I went downstairs expecting to find him on the couch, but he wasn't there. I called out that the game was over. A voice came from the basement saying he was down there. I thought he was messing with me. I walked to the basement door, opened it, and shouted down the stairs. He shouted back that he was still looking for me, and he asked where I was hiding. That made my stomach twist. I told him I was out now and standing in the kitchen. A second later, I heard him coming up the stairs. He stepped into the light and looked confused. He asked how I had gotten upstairs so fast. I told him I had been under the guest bed the whole time. He frowned and said he could have sworn he checked that room, and he heard someone moving inside. He said he thought he heard breathing. I told him I stayed perfectly still. We argued a little, but then we just shrugged it off. We played another round, but the whole time I felt uneasy. Every creak in the house made me jump. At one point while I was counting, I thought I heard something upstairs, like a soft thud, but when I searched, it was empty. I found Chris in the laundry room. We kept playing until we both got tired. Then we sat on the couch in the living room and turned the TV back on. That's when we both froze. From upstairs came a loud bump, like something heavy falling. Chris asked if it was my parents. I reminded him they were still gone. The hair on my arm stood up. We sat there waiting, but the house went silent again. Chris said maybe something slid off a shelf. I wanted to believe that, but then, while we sat listening, We both heard it clearly. A slow creak of floorboards, the sound of someone walking down the hall upstairs. We stared at each other, neither of us moving. Then I whispered that maybe we should check. Chris shook his head, saying no way, but if someone had broken in, we couldn't just sit there. I told him to stay behind me and grab the fireplace poker from beside the couch. We went to the stairs and started creeping up. The house was so quiet I could hear my own breathing. The steps groaned under our weight. When we reached the top, I pointed toward the guest room. The door was closed now. I knew for a fact I had left it cracked open. We stood there frozen. Then from behind the door came a sound, a slow dragging noise, like fabric sliding across the carpet. Chris whispered that we should leave. I wanted to, but curiosity and fear kept me in place. I raised the poker and reached for the knob. When I tell you my hands were shaking, I'm not just saying that to be dramatic for the story. I pushed the door open fast. The room was dark, but the shape of the bed and the dresser were visible. Nobody was there. The closet door stood half open. I moved closer as Chris stayed in the doorway. I yanked the closet door open. Inside was nothing but coats and boxes. We both let out shaky laughs, pretending it was all in our heads. But then, just as we turned to leave, we heard another sound. This time it wasn't upstairs. It was downstairs. The sound of the front door opening and closing. We froze again. Chris whispered that someone was in the house. I felt my stomach drop. We ran down the hall and crouched in my room with the lights off. I held the poker tight. We listened, and at first there was nothing. Then there were faint footsteps on the first floor. I wanted to call the police, but my phone was on the couch where we had been sitting. I whispered that maybe we could sneak out the window, but it was too small. The only way out was down the hall past the stairs. The footsteps moved closer. We heard the basement door open, then the steps went down one by one. We both exhaled in relief. Whoever it was had gone into the basement, so we took that time to run. We sprinted down the stairs through the kitchen and out the back door into the yard. We didn't stop until we reached Chris's house across the street. His parents were home, and when we told them what happened, they called the police. The officers searched my house from top to bottom. They found nothing. No signs of forced entry or anyone hiding in the basement. They told us it was probably just the house settling, or our imagination running wild while we played. But Chris and I both knew what we heard. We knew someone had been inside. For weeks after, I couldn't sleep well. Every creak made me think someone was in the hallway. That was the last time I played hide and seek ever. We're too old for it anyway. Chris and I never talked much about it again, but sometimes when we look at each other, I can tell we're both remembering that night. The night hide and seek turned into something else. Even now, years later, I still think about the sound of the closet door, the dragging noise in the carpet, and the footsteps on the first floor. We never found out who it was. Maybe a burglar who realized we were still home. Maybe someone who slipped out when we ran. All I know is that playing hide and seek that night showed us just how scary it is to realize you aren't alone in your own house. I grew up in a neighborhood that backed right up against a stretch of woods. The houses lined one side of the street, and behind them was nothing but trees for miles. When I was younger, a group of us kids from the street used to play together almost every weekend. In the summer, we stayed out late into the night, sometimes until our parents yelled for us to come home. One of our favorite games was hide and seek. We usually played in the backyards and into the edge of the woods. It was fun during the day, but at night it was different. The trees swallowed up the light and everything looked the same no matter where you were. That was what made it scary, and that was what made it fun. The last time I ever played hide and seek in those woods was when I was 14. It was August, hot and humid even at night. There were 5 of us, me, my friend Tyler, his little brother Matt, and 2 kids from down the street, Jason and Eric. We all decided to play outside because it felt cooler than sitting in someone's basement. The rule was simple. You could hide anywhere in the backyards or in the woods, but you had to stay close enough to hear when the seeker called the round over. Jason volunteered to be it first. The rest of us ran off. I went into the woods with Tyler. We split up once we passed the first row of trees. I crouched behind a fallen log, my heart beating hard even though it was just a game. I could hear Jason shouting numbers back in the yard, his voice echoing through the night. When he finished, everything went quiet. Crickets buzzed around me and the leaves rustled in the wind. I stayed low and still. After a while, I heard footsteps in the leaves. They were moving between the trees. I thought it was Jason. I held my breath and waited for him to pass. The footsteps stopped not far from me. Whoever it was stood there. I waited for them to call out or move again, but they didn't. I felt my skin prickle. I almost whispered to ask who it was, but then I remembered the rules. If I gave myself away, I would lose, so I stayed still. Finally, the steps started again. They crunched through the leaves, moving deeper into the woods. I listened until I couldn't hear them anymore. I peeked over the log, but it was too dark to see far. The moonlight only lit up the tops of the trees. I stayed hidden a few more minutes before I got tired of waiting. I crawled out and started creeping back toward the yards. As I walked, I heard Jason calling that the round was over and everyone should come out. I hurried back and found the others already in the yard. Jason had found Tyler and Eric, but not me or Matt. Matt came running out of the woods a minute later, covered in dirt. He laughed and said nobody would have found him. I told them that I had been behind the log and almost got caught when Jason walked right past me, but Jason looked confused. He said he never went that far into the woods. He said he only circled near the first trees and then found Tyler crouched by a fence. I squinted my eyes in confusion and then asked who it was that walked by me, but everyone just shrugged. We brushed it off and kept playing. The next round, I was seeker. I counted loud against a tree while the others scattered. When I finished, I searched the yards first. I found Eric hiding behind a shed and Tyler in the bushes. Then I went into the woods to look for Jason and Matt. The woods were quiet except for the bugs. My flashlight beam swung through the trees. I listened carefully, trying to catch movement. After a while, I spotted Matt crouched near a tree trunk. I shouted that I had him, and he ran back laughing. That left Jason. I searched deeper, calling out that I was coming. That was when I heard it again, the footsteps. The slow, heavy footsteps moving in the dark. They came from just ahead of me. I shined the flashlight that way, but the trees were thick. I walked slowly, trying not to make noise. The footsteps stopped. I waited. Now, admittedly, I was getting a little nervous. Then I heard Jason call from behind me that the round was over. I spun around. He was already walking back to the yard. Confused, I asked if he had just been ahead of me. He said no. He had been hiding closer to the house the whole time. I felt my stomach twist. Twice now, I had heard someone moving through the woods who wasn't one of us. I told myself it was probably an animal, but the steps had sounded human. Too heavy to be a raccoon or a fox, even a deer. We played a few more rounds. Every time I hid, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone else was out there. I kept hearing faint noises in the trees, branches snapping, leaves crunching. At one point, I even thought I saw a shadow move between the trees. But when I aimed my flashlight, it was gone. The others didn't notice anything. They just kept laughing and running. I tried to act normal, but I couldn't shake the nervous pit in my stomach. The last round of the night, Jason wanted to hide in the woods again. We all split up like before. I didn't want to go too far, so I stayed near the edge. I crouched low in the tall grass. I could see the faint glow of the porch lights through the trees. I heard Jason's faint voice in the distance counting. When he was done, there was once again silence. After a few minutes, I heard something that froze me in place. It was whispering. A low voice, too soft to make out the words, but it was close. My whole body tensed up. I peeked over the grass, but the woods were empty. I listened hard, but the whispering had stopped. A moment later, I heard footsteps again. They moved past me and into the trees. I lay trembling. That was when Jason called that the game was over. Everyone else came out, laughing and brushing dirt off themselves. I walked back slowly, my heart still racing. I told them I had heard someone whispering, but they all just laughed and said I was trying to scare them. I didn't argue, but I knew what I heard. We sat in Tyler's yard after that, drinking soda and talking. That was when Matt asked if anyone else had noticed the man. We all stopped and looked at him. He said while he was hiding, he thought he saw a tall man standing in the woods. He said the man didn't move, just stood there watching. Jason told him he was crazy. Eric laughed it off, but I felt sick because I believed him. We ended the night soon after. Everyone went home. I lay in bed that night, staring at my ceiling, unable to sleep. I kept hearing the whispering in my head, the slow crunch of footsteps in the leaves. I never played hide and seek in the woods again. Even now, years later, whenever I hear leaves crunch underfoot in the dark, I think back to that night. I think about that man that Matt said he saw. I think about the footsteps that weren't Jason's, and the whisper that I still can't explain. Maybe it was a stranger passing through. Maybe it was someone who lived out there. All I know is that when you hide in the dark woods, you never really know who else is hiding with you. It was a hot Saturday afternoon last July. I was 14 at the time, and I live out in the rural part of Pennsylvania. My backyard is huge. We have acres of open grass, trees, and an old storage shed at the edge of the yard. My friends and I spent almost every summer day out there. That day, it was me, Ryan, Josh, Adam. We were just messing around playing basketball on the hoop my dad put up near the garage. We played for about an hour before we were all tired and sitting in the grass, sweaty and drinking water. That's when we saw a kid we didn't recognize who came walking up from the dirt road that runs past my house. He looked about 16, older than us, taller too. He had black hair that was kind of messy and wore a gray shirt and jeans, even though it was hot out. We all stopped talking when we noticed him. He walked right up like he already knew us. He asked if we wanted to even the teams out and make it 3-on-3. None of us answered right away. Finally, Adam asked who he was. The kid said his name was Keith. He said he lived just up the road and was just walking through the woods when he saw us. We all kind of looked at each other. I've lived here my whole life and never saw this kid once. Neither had my friends. But he acted normal enough, I guess. Ben asked him if he wanted to play basketball. Keith shook his head and suggested we play manhunt instead. He said my yard was perfect for it since there were so many spots to hide. In the moment, I don't think any of us gave that comment a second thought, but in hindsight, that should have been a red flag. How would this kid know anything about my property? We all agreed to play. It sounded more fun than standing around in the heat. We split into 2 teams. Keith immediately volunteered to be on the hunting team first. He said he loved being the seeker. So it was Keith, Adam, and Josh hunting, and me, Ryan, and Ben hiding. Adam kicked a soccer ball to signal the start. We ran off into the yard while the hunters covered their eyes and counted. Ryan took off toward the tree line. Ben sprinted for the side of the garage. I didn't want to hide in the woods yet, so I went into the storage shed. It always smells like gasoline and old wood in there. I found a pile of folded tarps in the corner, so I climbed under one and lay still. I stayed under there for at least 10 minutes, but it felt like forever. Nobody came. I started thinking maybe the hunters had given up, but then the shed door creaked open. The tarp ripped off me in one quick motion. I guess it was an obvious spot. I looked up to Adam's smiling face. We both walked back to the patio. A few minutes later, Ben showed up. He'd been caught too. Eventually, Adam and Josh walked back. We all stood around drinking water, but Keith wasn't there. At first, nobody said anything. Then Josh asked where Keith went. None of us knew. We waited another 10 minutes, thinking he'd come walking back any second, but he never did. Adam finally shrugged and said maybe he was just some weird kid and left. The rest of us agreed, even though it felt strange that he would just disappear without saying anything. When the others left around sunset, I went inside. That's when I noticed something odd near my bedroom window. On the grass was this piece of rope. It was weathered and dirty, like it had been outside for months, but I know it hadn't been there earlier. I picked it up and tossed it aside, but it stuck in my head. The first thought I had was Keith. I told myself I was overthinking, but later that evening, I couldn't stop wondering if he'd gone inside the house while we were distracted. My dad usually leaves one of the side doors unlocked during the day. I went room by room, checking closets and under beds. Nothing. That night, I got ready for bed around 11. I laid there for maybe an hour scrolling on my phone when I heard something. Soft footsteps outside my door. I froze. My dad sometimes gets up at night to use the bathroom, but he always coughs or clears his throat. This was quiet. Too quiet. I called out for my dad. No answer. I sat up with my pulse racing. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. I finally got up and locked it. I stood there staring at the handle, waiting. After about 30 seconds, I heard the front door shut. The sound carried through the whole house. I didn't waste a second. I ran to my dad's room and shook him awake. He groggily sat up while I explained what I heard. He didn't doubt me. He grabbed the shotgun from under his bed and told me to stay close. We searched the whole house together. Every closet, the basement, the garage. He even went outside and walked the property with a flashlight, but he didn't find anything. We locked every door and window after that. The next day, I told my friends, and they all laughed it off, saying Keith was probably just some weirdo passing through. But Ryan admitted he thought Keith was strange too. He said Keith barely talked during the game. He just stared at people. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around 2 a.m, a scratching sound woke me up. It was coming from my bedroom window. I froze, staring at the blinds. The scratching was slow, like someone dragging a stick or nail against the glass. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. I carefully bent one of the blinds open just a crack. On the other side of the window was a figure. I couldn't see his face, just the shape of someone standing inches away in the dark. I jumped back and screamed for my dad. I ran into the hallway, shouting until he came out of his room. He didn't hesitate. He ran outside with a shotgun, firing 2 rounds into the air. I heard him yelling that he'd shoot whoever was out here if they came back. The figure at the window was gone. The rest of the night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the living room with the lights on while my dad stayed up too. The next morning, he told me he thought Keith had been the one messing with us. He said if that kid showed up again, he'd shoot him. I know he wasn't fully serious, but that's just how my dad is. He said that kid isn't welcome anywhere near our house ever again. As far as I know, Keith never came back. But sometimes when I'm outside at night, I think about that rope by my window, and I wonder what he was planning to do if I hadn't woken up when I did.